Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Simmons, and this is the EarthWorks podcast. And today I'm very excited because we're going to talk about a subject that is very confusing in our industry and one that we've been dealing with since 1988 when Jerry Bernetti and I started EarthWorks, and that's the subject of carbon. So for the subject of carbon, I brought the heavy hitters in here from Team EarthWorks, starting with Lawrence Mayhew, who is generally recognized internationally as a humic substance specialist, carbon specialist. And of course, our own brain trust of EarthWorks, who many of you have listened to, Mr. Jack Higgins. And we've been going around and around because in the industry right now, and I certainly see this, guys, as I'm doing academies, and this is Soil First Academy season. And, we're trying to qualify this word carbon, and it has now become the most overused word in the industry. So we've been using carbon as our foundation since the inception of EarthWorks. That's really what EarthWorks was started on. Our passion was to feed microbial populations and to get things going, but it has certainly not been an easy ride. It was very uncool in 1988 to be talking about carbon, and we were called every name in the book, and I think snake oil salesman was the nicest name that we were fed. And I remember Jerry at a couple of trade shows, and you guys knew Jerry very well. He got a little hot under the collar on some of these things when guys would tell us that we were going to ruin the industry because of this carbon-based fertilizer concept. And it's interesting now because some of those folks, so especially some of the synthetic fertilizer companies, are now in love with the word carbon. Jack wasn't at the show in San Diego this year, but if you walk around that show, the National Golf Show, you couldn't throw a dead cat without seeing somebody saying something about carbon. And the biggest fertilizer companies now are all coming out with carbon. And unfortunately, and what we want to accomplish here today, guys, is try to qualify what it is carbon is really all about agronomically, biologically, microbially, and really help folks understand what it is we're trying to accomplish and try to buffer some of the bad marketing, if you will. It's wonderful in my mind that these synthetic fertilizer guys are coming out with humic substances in their fertilizers, and it's great. We're talking carbon. We're realizing that, now there is some validity to this. The growth of EarthWorks has been exponential in the last 3-4 years. I think we may double our business again because people are starting to understand that feeding the soil really makes some sense. And even academia, interestingly enough, even though they're typically 10 years behind the times, are starting to talk about carbon and the value of carbon. So I'm not even sure where we start this conversation. It's a big one. And again, if we can do nothing more than help folks understand the diversity of what it is we're trying to accomplish, I think that's going to be a real big plus. So starting with the concept of what this is all about, Lawrence, let me kind of throw this into your field, because one of the things you have talked about a lot is breaking down carbon into this pyramid structure that we keep talking about: green, brown, and black carbon. But you've seen it, I'm sure, in agriculture. You've certainly seen it by talking to us. Carbon is hot commodity, and it's very misunderstood, and quite honestly, it's being poorly managed in the marketing of what this is all about. And having said all that, let's talk carbon.
Well, the simplest, carbon that is made by microbes, and you can find them in soils, compost piles, garbage cans, is methane gas, which is 1 atom of carbon, 4 atoms of hydrogen, CH4. That's the simplest organic hydrocarbon that I can think of. However, it's unstable. It's explosive. It wants to oxidize. It wants to change. It's very dangerous. It's poisonous. Yes. It wants to change states. Well, the simplest hydrocarbon compound, methane, is very indicative of what we're talking about today, because if we're putting carbon into our soils, what are you talking about? Are you talking about methane? Are you talking about, if you analyze carbon in a garbage can, you would find it's about 60-70% carbon in garbage and plastics. And is that the kind of carbon we want to put on? I don't think so. But
Right.
if you're going to loosely use the word carbon, then you're not saying anything. You're saying absolutely nothing. Ask the chemist what carbon is. Well, carbon is number 6 element on the periodic table. Oh, great. That tells me everything you need to know. No, not really. Can we use your pyramid? It works quite well.
Yes, I think it's a perfect description. And we've been using it. Actually, I stole it from Jerry back in the day, and it kind of explains how we go to formulation using short chain, medium chain, and long chain carbon so that we can continually feed microbial populations, which is really what we're talking about when we talk about carbon, food.
Okay, so the carbon cycle, which is a global cycle, starts out very simply with carbon dioxide floating around in the atmosphere. Plants capture carbon dioxide, and they actually bring it into the plant, and they combine it into more complex carbon compounds. So this is a natural process. The more complex, yes?
This is photosynthesis.
Through photosynthesis, correct. Everybody kind of knows that photosynthesis makes sugars, glucose, but that's a very simple organic compound, but it's still useful. It's more complex than carbon dioxide. So when you look at the carbon cycle starts out with CO2 in the atmosphere, goes through the plants feed the microbes end up feeding the plant back, and this back and forth leads to extremely complex carbons that are released into the soil, and their purpose is to make nutrition more efficient and to stabilize things in the soil that plants feed on and microbes feed on. So in a nutshell, the carbon cycle is a process of going from simple to more complex. As a product formulator, I think of those in the same terms. What do we want to put in a product to kind of kickstart the microbial activity in plants? Something simple like dextrose or glucose or molasses. These are relatively long chain carbons, but they're still simple by in the context of what we find in nature as stable carbon compounds. But the end goal is to get more and more complex carbons into the soil so that we can feed the soil, feed the plant through various and very complex interactions among the plants, the microbes, the metals that are in soils, the organic matter in soils. We need to define what organic matter is, because that's what shows up on a soil test. So that kind of kickstarts it. Nature goes from simple to complex. So do formulations that are very effective from an ecological standpoint.
Let's talk about that, because let's just qualify, first of all, the reason why we're talking about carbon is not necessarily to feed the plant. It's almost exclusively about making sure microbial populations are fed and are active. And because of that, because we're dealing in a very huge spectrum, and correct me if I'm wrong, Lawrence, I think we've cataloged 15% of the microbiome in the soil in this world. I mean, we hardly know anything about how many there are and how diverse they are, but we know they're extremely diverse. And so what we're trying,
it's probably less than 1%.
Oh, wow. So I'm not even close. There I go, lying again.
You're being very generous. Very
right,
generous.
Exactly. I'm trying to be generous. But the point being is that this is about microbes, and and this goes back to the conversation I started with, is that you're seeing folks talking about carbon, but they're really using such a narrow, limited scope of carbon in their products that they're not really feeding a very wide spectrum of microbial population. The word that Jerry Brunetti drove into my head when we started this project in the late 80s was that word diversity. And, I remember vividly having conversations and even arguments with Jerry about, we don't deal with linear formulations. We deal with very diverse and complex formulations, which has made my life miserable as a manufacturer, because we're trying to get 30 raw materials into a jug versus 2. And Lawrence, thank goodness you're on board with us, because keeping that in a jug is all but impossible. I was at a superintendent's office the other day, and they were all excited because they have, they were using, carbon products. And I said, well, do you mind if I see what you're looking at? And they shared with me a product, and it was literally 30% molasses. And that was really about all that was, and urea, of course, and iron. And that's my fear of what's going on in the industry, is that, we're throwing this word carbon out there, and then and you're seeing formulations with such limited carbon material, and then still dosing it with the salt fertilizers that give the color. Whereas if we can get microbiology really exploding, everybody, superintendents and grass growers' life is just going to be so much easier. And we have all those stories, and many of them have been here on the podcast telling their stories of how their life is easier because biological soil management has really created this. Talk to me. Let's qualify what you like talking about in terms of green, brown, and black. Let's qualify that and add some definition to this carbon pyramid a little bit.
Yeah, I owe that to Gary Zimmer, who comes right out of the regenerative agricultural world. He set up a whole company based upon principles of biological agriculture, which encourages the microbiome in soils first and above everything. And you said that your company was founded in 1988. He started his company in 1984. With one product, it was compost. And now Midwestern BioAg's probably the largest sustainable ag company, perhaps in the whole world.
And Gary, is for everybody to understand, Gary's one of the louder voices at Acres USA, works side by side with Jerry. And Jerry, in fact, started Agrodynamics, the sister company here, probably in the early 80s, probably even before Gary got going. And they became peers and worked very closely together, and kind of went down that same track of talking about this diversity and wonderful conversation.
I remember sitting in one of Gary's meetings over 20 years ago, well over that, where he started talking about green, brown, and black carbon in soils and how to encourage them, how to put them into soil, how to generate them, how to preserve them. And his concept is kind of simple. Green carbons will actually produce a burst of biological activity in soils. So sugars, for example, amino acids. So these are all relatively simple carbon inputs, but the intent is not to bring carbon to the plant. The intent is to bring carbon to the microbial population that will feed on them instantly. Well, if you took only sugar in the morning, you will get a burst. But you need more sustainable approach to human nutrition, just like soil nutrition is the same way. There's very, very, very little difference. The analogy between what goes on in our gut and what goes on in soil systems are very, very closely related. The same microbes are involved. In fact, the soil microbes are found in our gut doing the same thing they do in soils. So then you need some kind of carbon-based materials that come into this system that are a lot less explosive, let's call it that way. A little more stability, but still the ability to break down to some degree and then to be stable to some degree, and to some degree engage in nutrition, engage in exchanges, that these complex microbial and plant root exchanges. And that's what Gary Zimmer called brown carbon. So that's kind of in between the simplest carbons and the most complex carbons. All biological underground soil systems lead in basically an end product after all this is said and done, and those materials go through a process called humification. Composting is a good example of humification. You start out with materials that are very recognizable, real easy to break down, and they end up as materials that you can't even recognize. They look like soil, they look like dirt. They blend right into the soil system so well that you can't even separate them out of the soil system, but they're dark, they're very black. And these materials have gone through the process of humification. Now we have a very, very stable form of carbon in the soil. It's a natural process that only gets messed with by humans, by the way, that add high inputs of nitrogen into these systems that destroy that last bit. That if you were using high input agriculture or whatever you're doing, grasses in this case, high phosphorus, high potassium, high nitrogen, they all interrupt this final step in this process of going to very complex carbon materials, highly stable materials, and they engage in numerous interactions, and they provide the atmosphere underground for microbial and plant the combination of all this dance that goes on between microbes and plant roots. And that exchange and that stability is absolutely necessary for sustainability. And
so let me go back to this pyramid. So we're talking about this pyramid. So you've got green carbons, the sugars, simple stuff, the burst of energy, the brown materials, composts, humification process going on. I mean, just to kind of bring it into the world of grass growing, as we start growing root systems and they start digesting, they start to become a brown material, right? I mean, they're composting essentially.
Yeah, those are melanins.
There you go. So you're digesting, and then this black material you're referring to in common understanding here is the humic substances that we can apply to the soils. So we're building. So the material at the base of the pyramid, the black material, tends to be not even necessarily available carbon sources for microbial food, but structurally they're very valuable. Then as you go up the pyramid, you're into the brown materials, compost, and things of that nature. These are slower for microbes to digest, but they're more sustainable. And then you get to that pyramid, that pinnacle of that pyramid, and you got these really short chain carbons that are the burst. I think that's a great description. You know, if all we were to add to our fertility program was a humic substance, which is what is common right now, are we really, I mean, what kind of what are we really doing? I mean, obviously it's a benefit, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to criticize, because I love the fact that we're talking.
Yeah, the humic products industry is driven by large humified material deposits that are mostly in North America. And these companies would love it if everybody would just use their straight product and put it on the soil and call it done. Now, as
would
a
it
product
do anything?
No. Someone called me one day many, many years ago and said, Lawrence, how much can I put on per acre and see an effect or not see an effect? And they wanted me to use a leonardite material, which is extremely high in humic substance concentration. And they said, put it on straight, get back to me. I used a spot on my garden where I put on the equivalent of 12 ton per acre to see what would happen. And I didn't even see a color change in that soil. The point is, and Dan Oak from the USDA loves to point this out, if you try to raise the carbon content in your soil, you've got a real big challenge in front of you, because there's 1 million pounds of soil in the top 6 inches, and it's something like 60,000 pounds per acre of that natural soil system is carbon. How are you going to move that number?
Speaking to that point, I often talk about our approach as a catalyst, as a spark plug to encourage the plant and the microbiome to humify, to then do the hard work of build tons and tons and pounds of humus in the ground. But we're getting that engine started with this approach.
Exactly. My history as a product developer started out with Gary Zimmer's company, Midwestern BioAg, and they asked me to apply humates or humic substances, the raw materials, straight on fields. We treated numerous fields all over the Midwest, spreading anywhere from 0.5 ton to a couple of tons per acre, and we saw nothing. So I thought I was going to lose my job because nothing. You don't
nothing
get paid.
Happened. Nothing.
You don't get paid when nothing happens.
Yeah.
So the next year we combined raw humic ore material with various calcium inputs, and that's when we saw a huge difference in results. We saw root masses building. We saw production go up. We saw a lot of benefits then and only then. So for me as a product developer, that was a huge lesson. Now,
so why by adding a mineral did it make that big a change?
My theory is that once it hit the soil system, I don't think we did anything on our end other than blend. Yeah, I don't think we created a new product or anything. We never. That would be very misleading. What we did was just blend basic materials with the humic substances, put them in the ground. And I truly believe that once they got in the soil, the microbes took over. They knew exactly what to do with these materials. And I think it was through microbial interchanges with these materials under good conditions, water, so forth, that these materials interacted with each other and the microbes at that point, and then became beneficial to the plant system. I don't think that by blending some calcium with some humates is going to really create a new product or anything you could call chelated or complex anything like that. I do strongly believe that the soil system took control of those materials and then utilized them to their benefit.
I think that's really important to note, because we talk a lot about activating soil biology and we're feeding soil biology and everything, but we're plant growers, and
yeah.
So we're activating soil biology for a purpose for the plant, because we want to see a response in the plant after we activate soil biology. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about, that in activating soil biology, we excite that whole system and then get an exchange with the plant. Then we create bioavailability of these nutrients that the plant can easily uptake. And that's really where we want to be.
Yeah, when you were saying that, I kept thinking of the human microbiome in the gut again.
Mm-hmm.
And when everything is balanced and operating well, you have good health, right? Not only growth, but you have pretty good health. Now you take an antibiotic and it destroys the microbial population in the gut. You either start squirting or you lock up, right?
One or the other.
Now you got a problem.
Well said. Yeah. Yeah.
You've obviously destroyed something in that system that was functioning very, very well up until that point.
And it's interesting, it's a good point, because and again, I'll talk specifically the turf industry and golf courses in particular, but the environment is not a real one. And oftentimes we're building environments out of straight sand. So we don't even have a natural biome in some of those, or at least not a very large one. And so part of what we're trying to accomplish is provide that pyramid structure of carbon that feeds whatever population we can get in there. Let me do a little exercise here, Lawrence, and let's kind of talk about each one of these raw materials that are very popular in our industry, and kind of break it down so people understand. And let's start with why. I want people to understand why these materials would be of benefit, or maybe not, and break it down in things. And you broached one already. There's a whole spectrum of what we call sugars. I mean, it could be molasses, it could be sucrose, fructose, and you're talking about that as being the green, the real blast. So this material is used in products because it gives a quick pop, if you will, to microbial activity. So you feed them some sugars and they start getting off to work, and they start, working and hanging out. What's good about sugars? What's the dangers about sugars? Talk a little bit more about that specific category of carbon inputs.
Yeah, it's really about balance. I use the analogy of taking a teaspoon of sugar in the morning for your breakfast, for example. That'd be very.
Please don't do that.
That'd be a simple diet.
Yeah, not a good
cheap.
one, but
man, that'd be cheap.
Yeah,
right. If I want to develop a real cheap nutritional product for humans, I would just put straight sugar in something. And
isn't that what they're doing in these fast food products, is putting a lot of sugar in them just to give that quick carbohydrate?
Yes. Yes. You know what I couldn't believe many years ago when I used to eat, I won't use the name brand, but
Please
it was a big hamburger, massive hamburger, and a big order of super size me French fries. Chase that down with a soft, sugary drink. Big
gulp of it all.
I just took in more exactly number of calories I need to sustain my life for the rest of the day.
Right. Or 2,200
calories. I took in 2,200 calories. Okay, so I'm driving down the road. I was doing shows at that time. I was on the road a lot. I could almost set the timer to this. An hour and a half later, I was hungry.
Yes.
Crashed or asleep.
It was just such a mystery to me at the time. Like, how's that possible? I just took in 2,200 calories. I should be good for the rest of the day, but I wasn't. So what happens in natural systems like our body, we handle that immediately. We get it. We get rid of it. We even dump it. We want to process that fast and furiously. And that's exactly that. And you get a huge burst of energy. And now what? The fats weren't there to sustain the carbohydrate energy input system. No pyramid. It lacked those two things in that pyramid. It lacked something a little more stable underneath that sugar. It lacked something extremely stable underneath that. In our system, it's fats.
And this is common in the turf industry. You see a lot of products that are rich in molasses or other sugars, and really not very rich in anything other than some salt fertilizers. And
doesn't that make you wonder what the plant does?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's really not helping much of anything.
Well, further than that, I think a lot of grass growers can get this concept because they like to train the plant. They're training the plant to get behaviors out of that plant. But when you feed with a bunch of sugars, there's certain types of bacteria that process that. And
exactly.
And when you're talking about a huge spectrum of biology, if you're only focusing on the favorite food of a certain type of that spectrum, a certain section of that spectrum, then you're training that spectrum to get that sugar and want more and more and more. So and ignoring the whole wide variety of microbiology that you're trying to treat. But over time, you will train that community to only want that bit, and the community will become less diverse.
We've been using sugar since day one, and I never really understood until down the road. Jerry would put in molasses and fructose and sucrose, and it was all for exactly what Jack was just talking about, is creating a wider spectrum of food. And I remember vividly working with him in the early years about trying to figure out exactly how much sugars of these short chain, these green carbons that we want to have in our products, because you don't want to have too much, because then you just get fat and lazy microbes, and you don't want to have too little because you want that explosion. So having that perfect amount of these really short chain carbons is real important, and it pops the system so that now they can start feeding on some of these other things. Let me keep going down, and I'm going to be very blatant here. And this, the list of carbons are certainly things that we use. So, and there's probably others, and if we find others that we can talk about, that would be good. But we use seawater extracts that have been desalinated, and they're rich in pretty much all the carbons that are in the ocean. And we can start broaching the subject of they're also extremely rich in minerals. So we can remineralize the soil at the same time. What's in seawater, Lawrence, that is of value? And we've seen some phenomenal reactions to these materials.
Yeah, when you look at the seawater concentrate that we're using in these products, if we analyze it for organic carbon, which is what we're interested in, you get a number. You don't get a huge number, but that number has a significant impact. Talking to the person that makes it for us, he says they are primarily oligosaccharides, which are a kind of a sugar derivative that are released by microbes in the ocean, and also fulvic materials, humified materials, which are very common in oceans, waterways, lakes, and they are there because this process of humification goes on everywhere, even in oceans.
I'm not sure I knew that.
I didn't know that either.
What we have is a very highly stable form of carbon, organic carbon. Notice how I keep using the word organic?
Yes, you might want to qualify that.
Yeah, you mentioned this morning that somebody put limestone and acid in, and then they had a carbon product. Yeah, that's absolutely true. They had a carbonate that was in there before they treated it with an acid to release the calcium from the carbonate. That is a carbon compound. No question about it.
And that's the trick.
That's called inorganic carbon. IN organic carbon. It lacks the carbon chains, carbon to carbon to carbon. It lacks the multiple bonds of carbon to carbon and carbon to hydrogen and carbon to nitrogen. Carbon to oxygen is there, but there's a lot more than just carbon and oxygen bonds.
Urea is
Huge,
carbon.
huge. Yeah, urea. For many, many years, the industry exploited the fact that urea is a carbon compound, and they called it an organic fertilizer, because the word organic comes from organic chemistry originally, which is the chemistry of carbon that is in a very, very low reduced state, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, distinguishing between organic and inorganic carbon is very critical in my mind. And if we want to know if we're improving the carbon status of a soil, we analyze it for organic carbon, not inorganic.
And again, that really kind of qualifies what biological soil management is really about. It's the food source. I use the analogy a lot in talks. It's the gasoline in the tank of the truck, and it needs to be in that truck so that you can drive the truck down the road. And that's really what we're trying to do, is balancing one of the most basic agronomic principles, this carbon to nitrogen ratio in the soil, which is what, 10, 20, 30 to 1. And when you're in a soil that has been built out of sand and has not much more than some thatch, which is a long chain lignous, undigested, undigestible, or hard to digest carbon source, it's not a very rich food in that soil, providing ample activity for microbiology. So that's really what this conversation is about, is, how are we maximizing the feeding capabilities of microbial activity? Throwing some molasses into a spray tank, it's not going to cut it. Putting a little bit of humate in the back end of a high salt fertilizer, it's a good start, but it's certainly not feeding a diversity of microbiology. And it goes back to that word of diversity and understanding what these guys are doing down there.
Yeah, if we have thousands of genre of just bacteria alone in a soil, and within that genre we have millions of species, most of them have not been identified. And if you're throwing only simple carbon materials at the soil system, you are discouraging fungi, which require much more complex materials to break down, the melanins, the lignins, so forth. They require more complex carbon materials to break down. That's how they survive. And then you have nematodes and all these other things that are in there.
Beneficial nematodes.
Pardon?
Beneficial nematodes.
Well, 85% of them are.
Yeah,
that shifts.
Exactly.
That shifts to bad nematodes in systems that aren't sustainable.
Yeah,
it's
exactly like what we were talking about. Yeah. One part of the spectrum can take over, in an unsustainable fashion. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let me keep going down my list, Lawrence. We use, and this is one of the things that Jerry was really a big fan of, fermentation solids. What is that? Mm-hmm. Why is it beneficial? And is it just hocus pocus?
Oh no, Jerry called it industrial yogurt.
Yeah.
Which is a great way of describing that one out of many ingredients. Right now, we're struggling with formulations that might have as high as 30 ingredients in them.
Yes.
And this is one of them. Now, yogurt. Why do people eat yogurt? Why do you eat yogurt?
Lactobacillus.
Probiotic, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Meaning it encourages microbiological activity in the human gut. Okay, so Jerry visualized, why don't we do the same thing with the soil system? Why don't we encourage some microbiological activity with these fermentation solubles that he came up with? So they're soluble, they blend very well, they go into the soil very well, and they're from the process of fermentation. Jerry was a huge fan of fermentation, this, fermentation, that, everything. What we see on the human side of fermentation products is a huge improvement in people's health. Mm-hmm. And being that we're dealing with a system of soils that needs to be healthy, this sort of input seems to match and fits our goal very, very, very well.
And especially in light, I mean, why do we, when do we use medicinally, when do we use yogurts, is when we're taking an antibiotic, right? When our body is under pressure, and it's at that point where we have to do something to deal with an acute problem. This is exactly what's happening in our soil systems, is especially on a golf course. I mean, there are so many stresses and environmental concerns and physical stresses that we do need to use the antibiotic approach sometimes, pesticides, fungicides, but having these kind of materials brings that soil back to life, so we get through the acute problems when we have them. But again, it's all about, and the analogy of the human body, the soil is the stomach of the body, is so relevant here. If we can bring that soil back to health quickly, when we do have physical issues or when we do have some environmental stresses, it just gets that whole system working again. And that's what some of these fermentation solids really aid in the process. Again, standalone, I don't think they would work at all. But in a diverse formulation, in a program, that a superintendent might be working with, having that in the system buffers some of these things that we find having to do at times, and or buffering Mother Nature herself, because she can be pretty ugly to us as well. So it's all about keeping that system really working. Let me go down the list even further.
Well, first,
Go
let
ahead,
me.
Jack.
I can attest that I never forget to take my fermented medicine every day around 5 p.m. It's a very important part of my protocol.
Where you get a reminder.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yes, the clock is ticking, and you know it. Let's talk about worm tea.
If I could interrupt, you used the word standalone, and my gut reaction to that was, is there such a thing as a standalone product?
Or standalone.
It seems like, that's kind of what's happening in the industries. That, the industry is getting this, oh, well, these guys are starting to make some impact by talking about carbon, so let's throw molasses into our product and say we're carbon based. Well, yeah, you kind of are, but you're really not bringing a whole lot to the table. Yeah, I got a humate in my high salt fertilizer, which is great that we have these and we're talking about this, but it's standalone and it's fairly linear. And that's really all we're trying to do, is help people understand that, yes, these are great steps forward. There's no question, but we can do so much better, and diversity of these formulas, diversity of these programs is really what we're trying to accomplish in this conversation. Worm tea extracts, we've been using them for a while. They're very vogue right now in the industry. There's companies out there selling worm tea. They're wonderful, wonderful products. We're big believers because they're in every single one of our liquid products. And what does worm tea bring to the table, Lawrence? And is it green, brown, black? Where are we with this? Probably a little green and brown, right? What is it?
Brown.
Okay, I would have put it in the brown because there's it's got some legs. It's got some meat on the bone. Right. It's carbon that's going to be in that system for a while, which is good.
Well, and it's already started some digestion inherently because it's gone through the worm.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
The beauty of what comes out of the other side of the worm that we're using is that these materials have been gone, like you said, they've already gone through a digestive system. They've been attacked by acids and enzymes, and they're broken down into nutrients for the worm. The leftover material is actually, oddly enough, somewhat humidified to some degree, which is it's black. If you see worm castings on above a wormhole.
We do.
Yeah, if you see
unless
that,
you're using C3, which is a cheap plug for C3, but if you're not, you see worm castings.
Yeah, they're dark colored materials.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I never even made that analogy that this material going through this worm is humifying that that food that they're digesting. That's
there's so many interactions going on in the worm gut that actually humification is one of them. I'm not proposing that out comes humic acids or folic acids. I'm saying that they're partially humified, almost as if they've gone through a composting system. That's quite a miracle in such a short time, just one and the other. Now, the history on why these things got in our products is because Jerry and I had these discussions many, many years ago. What can we put in a product that's stable, it's complex, It has a high carbon content, and it has a lot of nutritional value. Nutrition meaning, nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, a lot of value. And the worm castings came right to the top of the discussion because they're already stabilized.
Yeah.
And the history of making natural products is you try to keep them from blowing up in the jug because they're so reactive. They're so active, not reactive, but they're so active. We're actually providing food for microorganisms on one part of the equation, and we've got to bring something stable into this product. And that's how we ended up going with the worm castings.
Now, again, as a linear
miraculous
product, worm tea is not great because it pushes hard. You need a lot of it. It can actually grow grass in this case pretty quickly. So, I mean,
good nitrogen content.
Lots of so I mean, to get the real digestive value and as a standalone, you got to push a lot of product, then you get a lot of growth. I mean, I've seen folks using standalone worm teas, and and ultimately they really get too much growth. It slows down the playability of the golf course, but having it as part of a formula, and again, probably a very small part. I mean, we're a handful of percentages in any one of our formulas, but it brings all that value to the table. And one of the things you guys talked about is that it's been digested, and I want to get right into one of our main product lines, which is the composting material. And I'll tell this story. When we got into business, and I was a punk kid, I didn't know anything about anything, and I was luckily able to kind of follow around this brilliant guy, Jerry Brunetti, and and he was very adamant that the raw material of a granular fertilizer should be something that has been digested. So we could have used human sludge, which has been pasteurized, cooked, baked, everything's killed out of it, and it brings very little value. There's no potassium to it, and it stinks like high heaven. But it was cheap. I mean, if we had gone down that road, my life would have been a lot easier because we could have made a really easy, fast, cheap product. But we see these products in soils, and they don't even digest in the soil because they're not alive. The other option would have been, using meal products, which are very popular and very good. But what he wanted to do was work with a material that has been digested. So what we're literally doing is finding this little digestion machine we call a chicken, feeding it meal products, which are rich in proteins and minerals, and then letting that little digestion machine, the chicken, digest it biologically. And as we know, they're incredibly inefficient at their digestion. So, and I tell this story often, I sat with the nutritionists at our plant, and they're always complaining because they have to put so much material in to get enough material out to build the shell of the egg, to keep the chicken healthy, because so much of that food literally just goes through a quick digestion and then out the back end. And I'm sitting there grinning and smiling because I'm benefiting, and certainly our friends and clients are benefiting it. And then we take it, because it's not a material that could be used, we take it and we put it into a second digestion, a composting system, for the better part of a year. So we've got 2 digestions on this material, and that's really the biology of it all and the mineralization of it all, is that you've got this incredible raw material, which is why compost is so incredibly effective, is because of the whole biological introduction. It's been digested, it's been broken down. You have all these things. And Lawrence, you talk extremely eloquently about the value and the byproducts of this biological process, this digestion thing. But that's the foundation of what we've been doing in these digestion materials. And you can address that biological activity in there if you would, please.
Yeah, the interesting thing about composting, which is your second step, your second digestive step, is that when the composting, the material that goes into the composting products, the original chicken crap, or we want to call it, stinks.
Let's call it that.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's called the worst. Yeah.
It really stinks. These are very simple carbonaceous compounds. They're simple carbons. They're very volatile in some cases.
You would put them more in the green category at that point.
Yeah, but some of them are pretty nasty.
Right.
Yeah, the human nose is a very interesting tool. It's sensitive to 11 parts per million to detect ammonia, for example. Ammonia is very poisonous to us. Yeah. 11 parts per million concentration in the air, we will smell it.
Wow.
Okay, because it's a powerful toxin. Our evolution has allowed us to develop that tool. Well, indoles, scatols, all these things that come out of the garbage cans and their crap at the original, we can detect those in nano,
Wow.
not parts per million, but in
Really?
nano parts per trillion.
Yes.
Because
Wow.
that's how toxic these materials are. Now, the interesting thing about the whole composting process is that you can use your nose to determine whether or not the
Yes.
compost is completed or not.
Especially when you're dealing with chicken crap, because it's,
Yeah,
it
so
gets very
what's
volatile.
happening here is the composting process alone has gone through a process of converting simple carbons into much, much more complex, stable carbons.
Let's talk a little bit more about this, because I get these calls all the time, is, guys trying to find a way to get a good slug of carbon into their system, and they find somebody locally that's producing a compost. And here's another word that has, a huge spectrum of definition. Compost is not compost. And, I go to properties, and I tell this one story a lot. I walk onto a property and I look at this big pile of stuff that this guy's got in his bin, and it looks like it's compost, or at least it was sold to him as compost. And when you look really closely and smell it, I could tell fairly quickly it was sludge, human waste. And then you'd look in there and there'd be these little chips of stuff, and it turned out to be chopped up wood pallets. And so my conversation was, what are you going to do with that stuff? And he goes, oh, that stuff's great. I said, why is it great? Because it's cheap. It's compost. I want to put compost on my fairways. And knowing that with that amount of carbon in that, we were actually going to start to denitrify the soil, take nitrogen out of the soil as opposed to adding it. So this carbon to nitrogen cycle can go in both directions. And that's exactly what happened, is he applied it to a fairway, and the fairway turned yellow because it would steal the nitrogen. So this conversation of compost is a great one, but we have to qualify that not all composts are made the same. And it's a very difficult process to make good compost, and it's a lengthy process, so it's often not very cheap because it takes a year to make it. So just strictly from a business standpoint, you got to imagine that a good compost is not going to be dirt cheap. And there's a lot of bad composts out there that I think have caused more harm than good. Layered out the soil, created a black layer within that profile because it's not digesting effectively. And, the other one that's really problematic is leaf compost that you get from municipalities, which are very high in things like potassium salt. So, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, you're absolutely right. And as a side note, you're probably going to see human biosolids universally banned sooner or later.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah, because of the polyfluorinated alkyl substances, the forever substances that are used in anything from lining the paper on your French fries to keep the oil from soaking in to real cheap Teflon pans. And these fluorinated compounds are highly carcinogenic. They're toxic, they're endocrine disruptors, and the composting process will not break them down. So these human biosolids have a relatively high concentration of these materials, and they're being banned, if I recall, in the state of Maryland or New Hampshire, somewhere up by you guys.
New England, Northeast, yeah. So chickens don't eat French fries, so there's not a whole lot of that. Some chickens might.
Yeah, that's a good thing there. Yeah.
Now, do you think that those forever chemicals get concentrated in the biosolids from what the humans are eating, or from the processing of that poop after it gets to, when it gets to the sewage plant?
No, it's from what people are dumping into the sewer system.
It's coming from our food system.
Yeah, from the food system. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Do you guys remember? I keep thinking about this. Do you remember Jerry relating chickens and worms and the earthworms? Wasn't that great?
It's kind of the same concept, right? It's all gone through the bird or the worm in this case, and they're little digestion machines.
But even their digestions work the same. Like chickens have gizzards, and worms use like little silica and little bits of mineral to help grind up in their little guts as well. And I think it was probably about how they were both relatively inefficient digesters, so that the manure and the castings became very valuable.
Yeah. And they are. I mean, you can buy castings and use it as a fertilizer. They'd actually be good fertilizer if you had a, ample supply of them all, which of course is impossible, but it is pretty.
Worms are little, yeah.
Let's keep going down my little list here. Meal products: alfalfa meal, kelp meal, bone meal, blood meal. Tell me why they're good. What's the drawbacks, Lawrence? And we're using meals in a lot of our products, obviously, in both granular and liquid form, and they're of great value, obviously. And meals are very popular in organic fertilizer products. So good, bad, indifferent. What's the story?
I raised the question a few minutes ago, is there such thing as a standalone product? And when these things were first brought to market, they're very popular with organic growers, but they relied on them as a standalone product because they have this NP and K value, and they have a tag value, a guaranteed analysis. Yeah. As with everything else, we find them very beneficial. They do provide complex and simple carbons, but we also treat them as an ingredient, not as a standalone product. But they do have a very good fit.
They've never been digested, so biologically, how do they stand? And what happens once they hit the soil biologically?
Yeah, biologically, they're readily available materials to microbes. So this would kind of fit the green-brown segment.
Okay. Now, is that true of all meal products, or is it? I know kelp meal is extremely, as a granular. Jerry used to call it the closest thing to humus in a bag because it's such a green, digestible food source for microbes. Is that true of alfalfa meal or blood meal or bone meal as well, or do they kind of fall in a different spectrum?
Yeah, bone meal takes quite a while to break down.
I would think so, and blood meal I would think probably would too. No.
Yeah, it's not rapid. Let's put it that way. Yeah, these are very stable inputs. Stable meaning it takes microbiology to convert them to nutrients.
I mean, that's been our stance all along, is that to have only a meal product and a granular fertilizer is not as fast as a digestion material for microbes as it would be a digested, composted material that is mineral dense, and then perhaps enhanced by adding molasses or humics or even synthetic nitrogens for that matter.
Yeah, we're all victims of this system that says it has to be highly soluble, has to be water soluble to be plant available. Yeah. And the system uses the word available. So that's why we invented the word bioavailable.
Yeah.
Let's get out of this idea that high salt, highly soluble synthetic materials are available. Is that right? And why do they lock up within hours after application?
It's a hydroponic idea, right?
Yes, it is.
It doesn't consider that there's a whole dynamic environment with organisms kind of acting as one large superorganism that react with all these inputs. It's not a hydroponic living in a test tube. It's not like that.
Mm-hmm. I remember early on in my career, I remember a professor, would say, don't worry about carbon in the soil. There's plenty of carbon in the soil. That's just, you don't need any to worry about that at all. And and I remember that statement vividly. And then I'd go to these properties and I'd look at them and there'd be nothing but thatch, and I use the analogy, and Lawrence, you can direct me if I'm wrong here, but I use the analogy, it'd be like you and me chewing on a pencil. It's carbon, but it's very long chain. It's the base of our pyramid, and these microbes, and we're talking turf now. So really what we're talking about is the undigested root system, or what we would call thatch. These things are not readily available. They're definitely not foodstuffs. The reason why companies like EarthWorks are really coming into fruition in our industry is because we're providing that bioavailability. We're providing a food source where the microbes can quickly come in and start. It's the green carbon. Thatch is not a green carbon. I don't know if we'd call it a black carbon, but it's closer to black than it is green. And that's one of the fallacies that I think we see a lot in in the industry is that, oh, there's plenty of carbon in soil. There is plenty of carbon perhaps, but it's not a food source. It's not gasoline in the truck. It's not going to move the vehicle down the road. And it could take a long time for it to become a food source for microbes. Again, qualifying biological soil management is about feeding microbial populations first, soil first, and then letting all that material work into creating mobility for nutrients in the plant. But this is one of my big frustrations. That's probably why I've stuck with this for 35 years, is that, that's the point right there, is that we have to feed microbes. Microbes feed the plant. We're not feeding the plant by putting down, blood meal and bone meal and compost and sugars. We're feeding the microbes that are then releasing the nutrients there. Yes, there are minerals with that, but I'm on a ranch, so stop me. Just get me off the podium at any point here, please. Save me, somebody.
You're good, man. I mean, you're totally right, because it is about the way to the plant is through the soil. I think it's very important. And without considering the soil via these digestible or easily digestible, longer to digest sort of formulations, you can't just rely on thatch and.
Yeah, well, it's not a food source. I mean, that's right. And again, that kind of goes back to the whole point of this conversation, is that you can't rely on just a humate, because it's not a food source for microbes. Humate and salt fertilizers isn't really feeding a microbe. It might be structurally building something. Let me keep going down
in a natural system, let's say a prairie, the thatch would eventually be covered by worm castings.
There you go.
Ground, yeah, you get the impression that the ground is rising, which it is. Right. And that thatch would be incorporated into the soil. Then it would be attacked by more, higher order, higher trophic organisms. Because the bacteria will not break it down at all. They don't have that ability. In a natural system, it's part of the ecosystem.
And that goes back to diversity of food sources in the soils program. And I get a real kick. I get calls from superintendents often that, they make their own programs, and I love it. I'm fascinated by, how much thought they put in it. They bring in their own compost, they bring in their own humic substances, they bring in some molasses, they bring in some worm tea, and they make their own EarthWorks products. And I think it's fantastic, but they get the fact that they need this level of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you about fish meal. And I just found out yesterday by talking to our cohort, it's becoming harder to find, because the price of fertilizer has gone through the roof. The supply of fish meal is becoming harder to get because the demand is through the roof with where we are. It's a wonderful, pretty balanced fertility product, right?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry. What is it?
If it were, then we'd have the ideal standalone product, wouldn't we?
Right. We don't do that.
Well said. I stand corrected.
Okay.
I apologize.
Yeah, I look at chemistry a lot differently than the industry does. When I look at something and you use the word balance, you just stepped into an area that's extremely difficult to define, much more difficult than just throwing the word carbon around. So if we had some fish meal all ground up and solubilized and put in a product, what would its chemical profile look like? I would strongly suspect that it's lacking some things, but strong on others. So just like any other ingredient that goes into our products, it's got this, it's got that, it's got this, but it doesn't have this and doesn't have that and doesn't have this. So it's not a standalone thing. However, a lot of amino acids, there's a huge benefit of the amino acid content in the fish products. That's because it's already gone through a hydrolyzation process. So they are bioavailable, baby. I mean, they're right in there with the green carbon. And
amino acids do some complexing work, meaning that they can grab onto ions and help in this bioavailability, but they're also an organic nitrogen source, right? I mean, that's another way to think about amino acids. They're nitrogen. They're protein.
Are plants taking up amino acids?
Yes.
To what extent?
To what extent? How do I answer that?
Do they take, I mean, is it all completely being taken up, or is it really being broken down
they
in the
compete.
soil?
They compete for them with the microbes. They want to take them up. They want to take them up, but the microbes usually beat them to the punch. So
Right.
there's a necessary balance going on there too.
So a lot of that is being broken down by microbial activity.
But the plants got that figured out too. They bring the microbes into their root system called rhizophagy. Then they strip them of their nutrients and then release them back out in the environment. So plants are smart.
Yes. I mean, yeah, plants are running the show there. Like when it comes, the microbiological system wants to find the plant root. That's where they want to hang. The plant
Exactly. That's where all the goodies are.
Yeah. And when I think about thatch and breaking down thatch, and I say like, well, the first part is running a lot of root systems through this thatch, because when we run the root systems through the thatch, the root systems are like the coral reef in the ocean. If the root system's there, then every other biological entity is coming there. And the mycorrhiza, first and foremost, then will extend the root system out further. Again, everything else will come there. Before you know it, the thatch layer that you were dealing with is now been tunneled through so much. And when it got tunneled through, then all this other kind of free-flowing microbial systems come around that. Now all of a sudden there is no thatch layer. It's been digested.
And you can feel it. I mean, I say this all the time. You get a thatch layer, you run it through your fingers, it's sticky and stemmy and doesn't break down. But a good digested thatch layer, now humus, it breaks up like a good chocolate cake would. It's beautiful. It's really good. Let me get to the last piece on my little list here, Lawrence, and it's your favorite one, but it's part of our pyramid, is the humic substances that we're adding. So all of this stuff that we're talking about, again, in self-serving terms, these are a lot of the materials that we'll put into a jug. And we put the humate in there to help stabilize all these things, because keeping all these little pieces of the puzzle together is not easy, but the humic substances pull it all together. But here's the thing that I really want to drive home is, humic substances are not a food source for microbes. So they're not, and I can't tell you how many times I hear, oh yeah, well, we put humic substances in our products so we can feed microbes. Well, you're not feeding microbes with humic substances. And again, you're more than welcome to take this to wherever I might be wrong.
Well, the reason why microbes don't feed on humic substances is twofold. Number one, they're extremely complex and highly stable because of their complexity. But the humic substances are there because the microbes build a house for themselves. They built the conditions where they can preserve moisture. They built these conditions where they can interact with nutrients under conditions that are very favorable to their lifestyle. Same reason why we build houses. We build houses to protect ourselves. We build houses so we have access to water, we have access to nutrients, we have storage systems here. The analogy is very,
shelter,
very
protection, strong. Protection from pathogens.
Yeah, the reef. The reef analogy is excellent that way. If a fish, which we can see, is endangered, they fly right into that reef and disappear in there. They escape predators. The smaller organisms are already there, and that microbes hide in a reef-like conditions. The same way we don't eat our chairs and our furniture in our house is the reason why microbes don't eat humic substances. They would be destroying the very conditions that they need to survive.
And the other thing I'm always fascinated by, and we're not going to show that chart, but the biochemistry of humic substances they have this ability to hold nitrogen and potassium and iron and calcium within that structure. So not only are they a physical structure for the safety of the microbe, if you will, but they're also holding some of these elements that might otherwise either leach off or volatilize out. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would make the only exception of that potassium.
Potassium does not get held by humate very well?
Somewhat, yeah, but potassium is very good at combining with clays and other minerals and
Okay.
kind of disappearing into that reef complex of everything. Very, very difficult. It takes biological activity to release potassium. So humates help potassium bioavailability to some extent. However, calcium would be the ideal candidate for that demonstration. Exchangeability of calcium cations in and out of the soil solution system is done primarily on the surfaces of clays and humic acids. But notice, you can't eliminate clays from this system either, which you have done to a great extent.
Yeah, well, sand. Yeah, built greens out of sand. So taking away the holding.
Makes for a very challenging situation.
Sure, but keep in mind that the golf course
manager, zeolite in there. You could put zeolite in, for example.
Which we do.
Yeah.
Good point. Yeah, the golf course manager is managing 3 acres of sand profile and 100 acres of a clay profile. So it's there. It's there.
Well, but a soccer field manager may be managing his entire field as sand, or many fairways. I was at a couple properties this week, sand-capped fairways. So I mean, we're I mean, and this is all done for a good reason: drainage. We want water to move off the court so that playability conditions are there. So I mean, none of this is criticism. It's just biologically and agronomically they become an issue. Let me ask you, Lawrence. One of the more popular things in our industry right now is biochar. And it gets compared very often to humic substances, humic acids. Is that a fair comparison? I mean, explain to us. And you know, I think a lot of folks find some great value out of biochars, but what's the differences and what's the you know, where do we play with these things?
Well, biochar is very good at holding water. And it can hold some nutrients to some degree, but it does not have a cation exchange capacity anywhere similar to humic substances, meaning that it doesn't provide the conditions for bioavailability. It's really positioned as increasing carbon in our soils by sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil rather than having a negative impact on the environment. Otherwise, by the way, biochars are part of the natural carbon cycle on prairie systems where there's fires. It's called pyrogenic carbon there, also called charcoal or black carbon, goes by various names. Biochar is a industry term for charcoal that's intended to be used in agricultural systems. Well, beyond those benefits that I just mentioned, the list is very short. And if you compare that to humic substances, which has a very, very, very long list of benefits, then they are not comparable. The best thing I could say about biochar is I believe it fits in these systems, but the biochar in terms of natural systems, it's part of the black carbon that's introduced into soils that over hundreds and thousands of years converts to humified materials. That's its position in natural systems.
I actually had a superintendent tell me that it had a very high CC, and I don't believe that to be true. And I think you just qualified that.
Well, that's easy to test. You just use the EPA method SW 9081.
Oh, that one. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, any lab will run that for you. You'll get your answer within
and the
a
other
week.
thing that I found, and I'm not trying to be critical of biochar, don't get me wrong, anybody, but because I do think there's a place for anything that helps hold moisture and builds a housing unit for microbes.
Totally agree.
But it tends to, I mean, the ones that I've seen tend to have very high pHs. And that's concerning, especially when they're talking about putting a lot of volume in. And again, it goes back to this conversation about diversity. And really what our model has really been about is little bits of a lot of things, because it brings that diversity, and a little bit of biochar into a very diverse product line or program can be very beneficial. A little bit of humic substance into a balanced, approached program where you bring in the green and the brown carbons is really kind of what we're talking about here, which is why our industry right now is getting more marketing than science, because we're getting, this big slug of black, or we're getting this big slug of green carbons, but not really a whole lot of folks talking about this whole pyramid of the green, brown, and black carbons that are really feeding this entire spectrum of microbiology and really the foundation of what biological soil management is all about.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, yeah, you have to build the
I
spectrum.
made you
And
speechless, didn't I?
you did. You did.
I'm glad. I'm gonna start to wrap this up, but again, the conversation is about, what is good carbon. I even have this conversation when I walk golf course with the superintendent. We look at the profile and we look at the carbon profile, and so many times you see this, 2 or 3, 4 inches of organic matter, and it's addressed as organic matter in our industry. And a lot of testing laboratories say, "Oh, we've got this organic matter, and it's really, oh, that's bad. We don't want organic matter." But the reality is that we're not qualifying the organic matter in the soil as, is it good? Is it thatch, or is it humus? And humus is obviously very good. And you could, any good superintendent can manage 4, 5, 6 inches of good humus, but managing 4 or 5, 6 inches of thatch, it's almost been impossible. It keeps you up at night, and it really, goes crazy. So what we're trying to accomplish is creating a biological soil management approach that helps keep the digestion of that lignous carbon going. And that digestion is really the whole point of what we're doing, is keeping biology active, keeping carbon to nitrogen ratio, so that when we do put down synthetic nitrogen, and we will, it gets through nitrification more efficiently. More of it is utilized, more of it gets to the plant. We can use less of it. I had a wonderful conversation with a superintendent this week that said, he's using almost no nitrogen, and everything has been so much better because his efficiency levels have gone up. And it's really interesting to see that, using less, we're getting better nutrient mobilization because microbes mobilize nutrients, right? And we're suppressing diseases. We're keeping checks and balances for pathogens, and we're managing moisture. We're managing water, which will ultimately become probably the biggest challenge of any growers of any crop in the next 10, 20 years, is making sure water is there.
I want to ask one question that I don't think we really addressed, but it's a large part of our product is and carbon in these systems of turf management is, how does carbon help, or how do these products help with managing contaminants, especially as we get into the season where growers are relying a whole lot on irrigation water. And
irrigation water.
And invariably they're adding bicarbonates, sodium. How does this approach help with managing those contaminants, which can really set the grower back as they stack up?
Lawrence, let me have you answer that, but let me throw also on top of that, some contaminants are some of the things that we bring to the table as well. Salts, salt fertilizers, and I don't mean that to be critical. That's not my intent. But we do know that high salts can affect biology, and pest control products, which we find ourselves having to use, obviously, in an environment like ours. Do these biological aids, does this carbon material help buffer all of that?
Yeah.
A little elaboration would have been nice.
I mean, let's talk first about sodium and bicarbonates, because they come in the water solution. Bicarbonates particularly are stacking up and really making a lot of other minerals insoluble or unavailable. How can we manage that with these products?
That's difficult to manage bicarbonates because they need to be flushed out with some sort of acid. That's the best way to manage bicarbonates. There's some competition between calcium and bicarbonate. In other words, you bring these complex carbons in there, you increase the cation exchange capacity, you're going to allow calcium to do a pretty good job of antagonizing all these nasties, and that will work to a certain degree. So they fit that system very well if you're managing those bicarbonates and that high sodium content. If you manage them by themselves, then these materials work quite well, but you cannot depend upon these high CEC, highly complex carbons to be your end-all savior, because they can only work to such a degree, and then before they get overwhelmed by bicarbonates and sodium, which you've got to get the bicarbonates and sodium flushed out of there.
which is why we work so hard at that and identifying all those.
Yeah, you have to. I'm not aware of any alternatives to that.
Well, we're going to be talking about that over time when we get some more flushing conversation going. And we've already been doing that with some other things. But I think, one of the things that we have done is helped, using some of these high humic substance materials to help kind of sequester them as we're flushing them through. So it still plays into the same game. Guys, I hate to do this, but we've certainly overstretched our welcome of an hour. And this is a conversation that needs to be done. And I hope this at least is a good starting point for everybody to understand that, carbon is critically important. Carbon is now going to be sold to you by everybody that walks into your door. And as I say in my talks, there's probably not a golf course superintendent or a sports field manager that doesn't have something in his shop that has something that we would call carbon in it, hopefully more than just urea. But it's not going away because it has certainly proved itself in the industry as being extremely valuable. And if you listen to the EarthWorks podcast, Jack and Kevin and Chad and I often are talking to, grass growers that have found and discovered, how this really works. I think back on the conversation I had a week or so back with Logan Freeman, and how he really discovered, some changing on a fairly low budget, and how carbon has really helped him. And Jack, he's been somebody you've worked pretty closely with. So, and we've got, more and more of these kind of stories, but this isn't going away. And the fact that you see the big fertilizer companies come in with carbon, it just kind of proves it to us. And I think it's encouraging. I love it.
I want to also say that Lawrence wrote a great article that we're going to include in the description for this podcast, a link to that article so that if you're into this conversation, you can read this article. And here, we're talking a lot about carbon. I just want to end with a quote from this article that the word carbon does not reveal the incredible complex carbon compounds that are important to plant and soil microbial growth. That this is not a simple conversation, and it really can't be dialed into one word. What is carbon? It's a very complex system that is important to the plant and the supporting microbial biology. So.
You stole my thunder. I was going to read the first sentence, which is, if a golf course superintendent applied diamonds to turf grass, was carbon applied to the turf? The answer is yes. So carbon is not all carbon is not all carbon. That's a great line, Lawrence, and I'm grateful. Yeah, we're going to post this on our website and make it more available for everybody. Lawrence, any closing thoughts? This is a big conversation. I think Jack just nailed it with the idea of that it's not a simple one.
Yeah, there's over 1 million organic carbon-based compounds in the universe. So which one do you want to talk about?
Right. Diamonds on the soles of my shoes, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, the diamond analogy, I thought, would drive the point home because it's a silly comment, but it's meant to be very, very silly because I did apply carbon if I applied diamonds to my turf.
Right.
I did. I applied carbon. Well,
a hopper full of diamonds isn't going to do the job.
It's not bioavailable.
Yeah. I remember very early, I think 1990, I was at a meeting where a professor got up and talked about this material called leondite. And I talked to my geologist friend, and he said this leondite is close to coal. And I don't know what adding coal would do to your soil. And Jerry, I think that's when I lost Jerry as a part of the EarthWorks team, because he just realized that, all right, these guys don't get it, but it's changed.
It were comments like that destroyed the humic product industry back in the 50s.
Yeah.
Close to coal, but it has oxygen in it. And that's a very important difference.
Huge difference.
Oxygen.
Oxygen.
Do we need oxygen? Now we have to sell oxygen? That's an important nutrient? I didn't even know that. Oh, well, gentlemen, thank you so much. Again, we can continue this, and I think we will continue this because it's such a important conversation. And obviously, if anybody has any questions as to really what the real value of carbon is in their program and how they can best utilize some of these raw materials, feel free to ask any of us here at EarthWorks, any of the agronomists. If we don't know the answer, we know the guy that we get the answer from, and he's been sitting here with us for the last hour or so. And it's nice to have people like Lawrence Mayhew on our team that can keep us. And I say this all the time, Lawrence. It's you keep us moving forward. I mean, we truly look forward to our hours with you when we spend time on Monday mornings, and we've gone to recording them because we can't remember all the stuff that you throw at us. But this article that Lawrence wrote, which I think is exceptional and describes the green, brown, black carbon, is going to be available on the website. And again, I want to thank everybody for participating in the EarthWorks podcast. If you're not a subscriber, please become a subscriber, because you get some pretty fascinating conversations like the one we just had with Lawrence Mayhew. And I think Mr. Higgins will be running a whole bunch more podcasts in the near future as well. So thank you all for joining us. Lawrence, Jack, thank you very much. Okay. Go have a wonderful weekend. And we will see everybody on another EarthWorks podcast.